You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I'm your host, Abraham.
And I'm your host, Shane.
I should have said welcome to Why We Do What We Do Mini, because this is a short bite-sized episode. We're going to try and keep it under 15 minutes. That's what we do.
Yeah, which is an impressive feat for us because we do not do that.
We are long-winded AF. All right.
Yeah.
But today, and normally when we've done this, we've actually had them fairly scripted. We've had a really close, specific agenda for what we're going to accomplish and the length of this topic. And this one, I chose to go the exact furthest opposite route I've ever gone on anything we've ever done on this podcast, which is Shane doesn't even know what we're talking about yet.
I have no idea. Could not even hazard a guess.
Because I wanted this to be a dialogue, because a question occurred to me this week, and I wanted to answer it, and I wanted to have it be sort of a heart-to-heart conversation. So Shane, are you ready?
As ready as I could possibly be.
Okay, so I want to get your opinion on this. As ready as you possibly be. That's great. How important do you think philosophy is to competency? So how important is it for someone's relative competency in a subject to also have the sort of philosophy and understanding of that subject?
Ooh, that's a really difficult question.
Right?
I think it's really important, but I guess maybe something that's important for me to maybe express is that I think that a well-rounded education that gives you skills, intellectual tools to problem solve, to think critically, to criticize, to turn an idea around over, like, I think that in itself is so critical. And I feel like you can't do that without philosophy. So, like, I feel like if you're going to be competent about something, I don't think that you need to, for example, like, I don't think that you need to be, like, have philosophy to be competent in, like, a particular practice in terms of, like, application of something. Like, I don't think that's required for fluency in that particular skill is maybe what I'm saying. But I think if you're going to go the route of, like, calling yourself an expert, then you should know every facet of this thing, or at least have the skills to be able to explore every facet of whatever the concept or principle or thing is, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. I think I'm picking up what you're laying down there. I get what you're saying.
Hey!
I sort of came up with some scenarios for trying to highlight whether or not, because as you said, like, on the one hand, thinking that philosophy is critically important kind of in a way means that people who get trained to a level of fluency and competency at something are still not good enough at it because they don't have the philosophy, right? Like, you imagine people who maybe never had a chance to go to college, maybe even never had a chance to graduate high school, but nevertheless picked up some technical profession for which they're perfectly good at it. Like, they can do their job.
Sure.
But here's an example I came up with. I was wondering, like, and because I have a direction I'm going with this specifically, right?
Okay.
Let's say you had like a plumber who they can perfectly install plumbing. They can put in pipes, they can hook up a toilet, they can hook up a sink. They know how to do that thing. They're fine. If you hire them for a job, they'll come in and do that job just fine. But what they believe is that the reason plumbing works is because incorporeal magic gnomes are moving water pressure through those pipes.
Sure.
And that is how the system works in every situation of plumbing. Does that in any way inhibit their ability to be a good plumber?
I think no, but I do think that there's a lot to unpack within that because they lack some level of introspection or knowledge base that they're going to pass on to somebody else. So, like, I think of it from that perspective. Like, individually, probably doesn't matter that much. But I think from a perspective of if they're a teacher, if they have apprentices and they're teaching that down the line, and that's like the base of knowledge that gets passed down, then that becomes like a harmful thing. So I think it really depends on where that goes and how much spread that particular philosophy or particular thought has, right?
I mean, you could be right. And I think that presumably they could pass on their knowledge of how to do things perfectly well, but then also pass on their knowledge of their beliefs about the incorporeal magic gnomes who move water around the various plumbing fixtures.
Right.
But what also occurred to me is what happens when they run into a situation that is, they've done all the mechanical part of it right, but it's still not working correctly. And they don't understand things like atmospheric pressure and hydrodynamics and basic like principles of chemistry and natural science that govern how plumbing actually works. How do they problem solve a situation where the incorporeal gnomes are behaving erratically?
I think that question, to unpack that a little bit, is that an issue of a philosophy getting in the way, or is that an issue of a gap in their knowledge from some other place? Because I don't think that those two are necessarily directly linked in that way. Like, I think that somebody could have still a knowledge of atmospheric pressure and all that stuff and still have the belief that, like, atmospheric pressure is caused by invisible gnomes or whatever. Like, I think that you could there's probably like layers to that you could unpack. I don't know that a lack of knowledge necessarily implies a philosophic problem, if that makes sense.
At some point, though, my thought was that the belief in the supernatural will meet at a point where the causes have to be from natural science, like things that we understand from a natural science perspective, and will be directly at odds with things we understand with a supernatural belief.
Sure.
And so at some point, those two cross paths, and they are no longer going to be effective because they don't have that natural science, even basic philosophy of like, what are the factors that could be related to the problem I'm encountering? As technology develops and things become new, will they be able to follow the logic of why something works differently than how it used to work?
Yeah.
Because it's now relying on a different system of pressure than something, or a different kind of seal, or a different kind of piping material, whatever it might be.
Yeah, so I hear that. So I think maybe where I keep going back to, and this is probably because of my worldview, is that I go, okay, so they're going to come to an impasse with this philosophical belief versus this like actual practical application. That's going to happen at some point, and I can see that happening. To me, like, if I'm doing that, like, I go back to like, well, what's the core issue? Because feel like philosophy is so like thought experiments and so like a whole different kind of level of like intellectual engagement. And so I go, okay, so what happens when I come into the impasse when I don't know how to do something or how to fix something? I go, I need help, right? So like I lean into that going, well, I arrive at a certain area and that becomes a skill deficit, not necessarily a philosophical crisis or something, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Now my question goes, when I arrive at that impasse, is my philosophical belief flexible enough that I can learn the skill around this to still hold that belief and still gain more knowledge to move forward? I think that's another kind of individual skill set to look at, is like,
okay,
can I hold this philosophical belief while also learning new skills to continue to gain more competence? Because I always think of, when I was in grad school, I think of that the phrase, science doesn't have a finish line. So where like invisible gnomes does, right? Like there's a finish line for that, where the science and the advancement of technology doesn't have that finish line. And so I feel like that's kind of the crux or the problem, is that if they don't have that skill set to put it aside for a second and learn a new skill, then that might be a different issue. If they're refusing to learn something because they're like, I'm not going to learn that because the gnomes are going to be mad at me. If that's, I'm going to go, you should probably talk to a therapist first. Second, there's a different conversation to be had there, right? So I think that's probably where I would arrive from that flexibility, that psychological flexibility standpoint.
Well, and just to be clear, I think when you say science doesn't have a finish line, but the gnomes do, is suggesting that because science is a process, right? So it's ongoing. It just
right
is constantly evaluating and reevaluating. Whereas the idea of the incorporeal gnomes is the answer. It's like, we don't have anywhere else to go. We have our solution, right? It's not a process. Right. So just to make sure people are clear on that. Now, the reason I chose incorporeal gnomes as the answer is because nobody believes that. I just made it up. Like, I was pretty confident I could make up a thing, and like, this is not an established set of superstitions or things that you're going to go around and ask people and they're going to be like, oh yeah, sure, the incorporeal gnomes.
But I'm into it now.
Great. So I wanted to get this closer and closer to reality over a series of examples, and I think the next one's going to go a little bit faster. So the next one is like, okay, so incorporeal gnomes, where we're putting that aside. Now let's go on to, and we're talking about like how Plummer interacts with that. Now we're going to go on to a natural scientist who believes in ghosts, right?
Yeah,
because
sure.
I think this is the exact same problem. You have someone who's doing an interpretation analysis of the world, probably solving problems, might have some actual practical application of theirs, but they also believe that ghosts exist. And what I'm asking is, like, does that belief hinder how far they can go as natural scientists? Because their philosophy allows for something that is directly in contrast with the reality of the world that they're interacting with.
Let's unpack that for a second, because I think then the question becomes, is it a hindrance because they can't see beyond that, or is it a hindrance because they are unwilling to adapt, right? So like I think that's a conversation to be had within that. So there's a point where they go, okay, so like this is my answer. And I guess maybe what I'm saying is I think it only becomes a hindrance if they are unwilling to learn something new or their curiosity stops about like some type of inquiry. If inquiry stops because of that, then that becomes a different thing. Because I've worked with scientists that believe in God, and is that not kind of a similar thing where you kind of go, okay, well, like
you're jumping ahead, Shane.
I'm sorry. Okay, I take it back. I didn't say anything about the Bible, but what I'm saying, I guess, is if it becomes a space where they no longer have scientific inquiry, they don't have the ability to ask relevant questions that are related to the actual application, then I think that, yeah, that's when it becomes a problem. I don't think that having the two ideas at the same time is a problem. I think that when they start intersecting and they do stop each other, that becomes a problem for the scientist part, at least.
And I think that's a very reasonable place to be. And I appreciate your sort of devil's advocate position on this. And so I would actually argue that kind of has to create a hindrance. Unless your work is pretty narrow and it does not ever ask you to ask questions outside of what is whatever the relatively small scope of observation that you rely on, that maybe you can be completely divorced from something like the idea of ghosts, at some point you're going to run into causal mechanisms that clash with one another.
Sure.
Like you don't get to have a natural science observation of the world and also believe that ghosts exist. At some point within those cross paths, you probably could if you don't ever expand out of whatever narrow niche sort of field that has nothing to do with ghosts might exist. But at some point, I think that inherently will create that hindrance for a lot of natural scientists and probably not all of them.
Yeah.
So the next one, again, we're coming up on time, so going fast, is taking the same exact idea, because I think incorporeal gnomes affecting plumbing, same exact thing as ghosts affecting natural science, same exact thing in my mind as believing in extraterrestrial aliens living among us is to astronomers. And then as you jump the gun is like, okay, so then a scientist believing in God. Because, and this is actually funny, is because this just came up in a recent training I had to complete, and I don't think that they meant this to be as funny as I found it to be at all.
Sure.
But they were sort of like saying, if you're trying to do science, but your religious belief tells you that this can't possibly be the answer, then like you're probably not a good candidate to be doing that science, because you won't be able to see beyond the preconceived beliefs that you have that already tell you that you think you know the answer before you even ask the question. So you come into it with bias. And I thought that was very funny, because I'm like, basically what you're saying as part of a training is that people who are religious can't be maximally good scientists, depending on the questions that they're asking. Because I think they just said it might be the case that these beliefs could clash with because it creates preconceived notions and conclusions, where you then come in with a very heavy-handed bias that influences your decision. I was like, that does make sense. And so then the question becomes, again, just bringing it full circle, does your philosophy impact competency? If you allow yourself to embrace philosophy that allows for supernatural, non-metaphysical things, or I guess metaphysical things, to exist, does that hinder how good you could possibly be, like as competent as you could possibly be as a scientist or in any given field, really?
I think that's a fair question. I think what I arrive on this is that, yes, it can, but it's still a circumstantial view. Like, I still go back to that, where I think it really depends on how lightly or how strongly you hold to that philosophical belief and how willing you are to adjust that philosophical belief in the name of whatever new knowledge comes up, right? I think of Neil deGrasse Tyson or whatever.
Yeah.
He talks about, somebody had asked him about the existence of God, and he says, well, that he kind of brought up this really great argument saying that, at this point in time, there is no evidence to me that says that this entity or this thing exists. So I have a hard time believing this as a scientist when this exists. However, I am more than willing to shift my viewpoint around that. And so I think that regardless of what your philosophy is, if you hold your philosophy too tight, then that prevents you from being a good scientist, period, because a good scientist is able to adjust their viewpoints based on new data. And if your philosophy doesn't allow you to adjust your new points, your viewpoints based on new data, then I go back to that being a skill deficit. You're holding on to something too tightly, which is preventing you from gaining a skill or kind of setting up a ceiling for you.
Fair enough. And I also say, I think just to sort of end on is that the other thing here is that beliefs aren't real things. And so you can believe any number of contrasting ideas or say that any number of contrasting ideas at the same time. And even though we understand them to symbolically represent things that are at contrast with one another, it doesn't affect the natural world as it exists. I can say I am up and down and black and white and real and not real and here and not here all at the same time. It doesn't matter that I said those things because
all right, Schrodinger.
Because I'm Schrodinger. Because they're just words, and the words ultimately don't have any bearing on the natural world. It simply is my orientation to it, and even my orientation to it again is essentially an arbitrary fabrication that is symbolic in nature. So that being said, those are things that drastically impact my ability to think and do work, because what I'm doing is when I'm thinking and doing work, I'm using my language, and my language is philosophy is part of the language that I use. So
yeah,
all right,
that's fair.
That was really fun. Thank you for going on that journey with me.
Yeah.
I think we're sort of at time. We might even have to have Justin cut this down a little bit to get to 15 minutes, but thank you for being open to that conversation. Thank you everybody for listening. This is Why We Do What We Do. Minnie, is there anything for you that you'd like to add or anything that I missed before we wrap up here?
Have fun, y'all. Enjoy philosophy a little bit. Go read some Socrates or Socrates or whatever his name is.
Yeah, I hope I give everyone a little bit something to think about and see. Let us know. Let us know. Did we get it wrong? Do you disagree? Reach out to us. You can email us directly at info@wwdpodcast.com or reach us on the social media platforms. But I think I'll let it go at that. This is Abraham.
This is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.